Welcome to the Wings of Kitty Hawk, How the Wright Brothers Conquered the Air.
This is the story of two brothers who did something that most people believed was impossible.
For thousands of years, humans looked up at birds and dreamed of flying. But the sky seemed completely out of reach.
Then two young men from Ohio, who ran a bicycle shop, decided to solve the problem that had defeated everyone else.
They had no university degrees. They had no government money. They had no famous scientists helping them.
What they had was curiosity, patience, and a very clear way of thinking about problems.
In this documentary, we will follow their journey from the earliest dreams of human flight to the 12 seconds that changed the world forever.
We will see how they solved the puzzle of control, how they built their own engine, and how the world slowly came to understand what they had done.
This is the story of the Wright brothers and the birth of the age of flight. Let us begin. Let us start with a question. Before the Wright brothers, did anyone ever try to fly?
I think people tried for a very long time. There are old stories about people jumping off buildings with wings attached to their arms.
Yes, and most of those attempts ended very badly. But by the late 1800s, the attempts became more scientific, and one man made more progress than anyone before him.
Who was that?
A German engineer named Otto Lilienthal. He studied birds very carefully for many years. He watched how their wings were shaped and how they moved in the air.
And he used that knowledge to build something?
He built gliders. A glider is an aircraft with no engine. It uses the shape of its wings and the movement of air to stay up. Lilienthal made over 2,000 glider flights in the 1890s.
2,000 flights. That is remarkable. So he could already fly in a way.
In a way, yes. He could glide through the air for short distances. And very importantly, he recorded everything. He wrote down measurements, angles, and observations about how air moved over different wing shapes.
So he left a lot of data for others to use.
Very valuable data, yes. The Wright brothers read his work carefully. Lilienthal was one of their most important teachers, even though they never met him.
What happened to Lilienthal?
He died in 1896 when one of his gliders lost control and he fell to the ground. He died from his injuries the next day. It was a great loss for the world of flight.
That must have discouraged many people.
It discouraged some, but it also showed that the problem of control was the most important problem to solve. Lilienthal could get into the air, but he could not control his aircraft well enough to stay safe.
And at that time, did most scientists believe that powered flight was possible?
No. Many serious scientists believed it was simply impossible. The common belief was that any object heavier than air could not fly under its own power. This seemed logical to many people.
But birds are heavier than air, and they fly.
Yes, but people did not fully understand how birds fly. The science of aerodynamics, how air moves around objects, was not well developed at that time. So the skepticism was widespread, even among educated people.
And where were the Wright brothers during all of this?
They were in Dayton, Ohio, running a bicycle shop. They built and repaired bicycles. It was a modest business, but it taught them a great deal about mechanics, about balance, and about how moving parts work together.
It seems like an unusual background for someone who would invent the airplane.
It was unusual, but it was also perfect. Working with bicycles taught them to think practically. They were not theorists who worked only with mathematics and ideas. They were people who worked with their hands, who built things, tested them, fixed them, and built them again.
When did they first become interested in flying?
Their interest began in childhood. Their father gave them a small toy helicopter made of cork and bamboo when they were boys. It flew through the air using a twisted rubber band. They were fascinated by it.
A toy started everything.
In a way, yes. And as they grew older and read about Lilienthal and others, their childhood fascination became a serious goal. They began to read everything they could find about flight.
And they decided that control was the key problem.
Exactly. Most other inventors focused on power. They thought that if you had a strong enough engine, you could force a machine into the air. The Wright brothers thought differently. They believed you first needed to understand how to control a flying machine before you worried about power.
That was a very different way of thinking.
It was the insight that made the difference, and it came partly from their experience with bicycles. A bicycle is not stable by itself. It falls over without a rider. But a skilled rider can balance it perfectly and steer it anywhere.
So they thought of a flying machine the same way.
Precisely. Not a stable platform floating in the air, but a dynamic machine that needed constant, skilled control. That idea changed everything about how they approached the problem.
But if we apply the principles from this diagram here, we can minimize the drag coefficient.
Yes, I see it now. That changes everything.
So the Wright brothers decided that control was the central problem. But how do you control something flying through the air?
I suppose you need to be able to turn left and right, and also go up and down.
Yes. And there is a third type of movement that many people forget. You need to be able to tilt side to side to keep the wings level. These three types of movement are called pitch, yaw, and roll.
Pitch, yaw, and roll. Can you explain each one simply?
Of course. Pitch is the nose of the aircraft going up or down. Yaw is the nose turning left or right. And roll is one wing going up while the other goes down, like tilting.
And before the Wright brothers, nobody had figured out how to control all three?
Nobody had solved all three together in a practical way. No. And the Wright brothers realized that roll was the most neglected and most dangerous problem. If the wings tilted too far to one side, the aircraft would fall.
So how did they solve the roll problem?
Orville Wright had an idea one day while he was at the bicycle shop. He was holding an empty cardboard box, turning it in his hands. He noticed that if he twisted the box slightly, the two ends twisted in opposite directions.
And he thought of applying that to wings?
Yes. If you could twist one end of a wing to change its angle while twisting the other end in the opposite direction, you could control which side produced more lift and which side produced less. This would let you control the roll.
That is very clever. And how did they actually do this on a real wing?
They built wings from wood and fabric, with wires attached to the wingtips. By pulling the wires, the pilot could twist the entire wing. They called this wing warping.
It sounds simple, but it must have taken a lot of testing to get right.
Many months of testing. They built kites and gliders to test wing warping before they ever thought about adding an engine. They flew hundreds of gliders at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, a place with strong and steady winds and soft sand for landing.
Why did they choose Kitty Hawk specifically?
They wrote to the United States Weather Bureau and asked for a list of places with strong, consistent winds. Kitty Hawk was recommended. The winds there were reliable, which was important for testing, and the sand dunes made for softer landings when things went wrong.
And things went wrong often, I imagine.
Very often. But each failure gave them information. They were systematic. They changed one thing at a time and recorded the results carefully. This scientific approach was unusual for inventors of that time.
What about the lift data? I heard they discovered that existing data about lift was wrong.
Yes, this was very important. Lilienthal and others had published tables of data about how much lift different wing shapes produced. The Wright brothers used this data to design their gliders, but the gliders did not perform as expected.
So the data was wrong?
It was inaccurate. The Wright brothers suspected this, so they built their own wind tunnel. A wind tunnel is a box with a fan that blows air through it. You put a small model of a wing inside and measure how the air behaves.
They built it themselves?
They built it themselves, in their bicycle shop, in 1901. It was a simple wooden box, but it worked. They tested over 200 different wing shapes inside it and carefully recorded all the measurements.
And they found that the existing data was wrong.
Significantly wrong, yes. The lift produced by wings was different from what the published tables said. By correcting this data, they could design wings that actually worked as predicted.
That is a huge step. They were doing original scientific research, not just building things.
Exactly. They were engineers and scientists at the same time. And this combination of careful scientific measurement with practical mechanical skill was what made them different from all the other inventors trying to solve the same problem.
You mentioned earlier that they thought of the airplane like a bicycle. Can you explain that more?
Yes. Most people at that time imagined a flying machine as something like a boat in the air. A boat is stable. It sits in the water and does not tip over easily. People wanted an aircraft that was naturally stable, that would fly straight without the pilot doing much.
But the Wright brothers disagreed with that idea.
They did. A bicycle is not stable on its own. It falls over if nobody is riding it. But with a skilled rider, it is perfectly controllable and can go anywhere. They believed a flying machine should be the same, designed to be controlled actively, not to be naturally stable.
And that made it more practical?
Much more practical. A naturally stable aircraft that corrects itself is harder to turn and maneuver. An actively controlled aircraft responds to the pilot. The pilot is always in command.
So the three-axis control system, pitch, yaw, and roll, was their fundamental contribution.
Yes. And this system is still the basis of how every aircraft in the world is controlled today. When you fly on a modern airplane, the pilots are using the same three-axis control principle that the Wright brothers established in those sand dunes more than 100 years ago.
That is a remarkable legacy from two bicycle mechanics with a cardboard box.
It truly is. The great ideas are often born from very simple observations. Orville twisted a box, and from that twist, the age of aviation began to take shape. We now know that the Wright brothers solved the problem of control. But knowing how to control a flying machine is not enough. You also need the power to get it into the air.
So they needed an engine.
Yes. And this turned out to be another very difficult problem. In 1902, they had a working glider that they could control well. The next step was to add an engine and propellers to make it fly on its own power.
Could they not just buy an engine from somewhere?
That was their first idea. They wrote to several engine manufacturers and asked if anyone made an engine that was light enough and powerful enough for their needs.
And nobody had what they needed?
Nobody. The engines available at that time were either too heavy or too weak. For a flying machine, weight is everything. Every extra kilogram makes it harder to get off the ground. They needed an engine that was light, but still produced enough power.
So they decided to build their own engine.
They had no choice. Their bicycle shop mechanic, a young man named Charlie Taylor, helped them design and build an engine from scratch. Charlie Taylor is often forgotten in the story of the Wright brothers, but his contribution was essential.
What kind of engine did they build?
It was a 4-cylinder gasoline engine. It produced about 12 horsepower. That does not sound like much by modern standards, but for its weight, it was quite good. The key was the material they used.
What material?
Aluminum. At that time, aluminum was a relatively new material. It was much lighter than iron or steel. By casting the engine block from aluminum alloy, they were able to keep the weight very low. The entire engine weighed only about 82 kilograms.
And was that light enough?
Just barely. Every part of the aircraft had to be as light as possible. The frame was made from spruce wood, which is strong but light. The wings were covered with a light cotton fabric. Every single component was chosen or designed to minimize weight.
It sounds like the whole design process was a constant battle against weight.
Exactly. And then there was the propeller problem, which turned out to be just as challenging as the engine.
Why was the propeller so difficult? It is just a spinning blade, is it not?
That is what everyone thought. And that was the problem. When the Wright brothers looked for scientific data about propeller design, they found almost nothing useful. Ship propellers had been studied, but an air propeller is a very different thing.
How is it different?
A ship propeller pushes against water, which is thick and heavy. An air propeller pushes against air, which is thin and light. The physics are quite different, and the Wright brothers could not simply copy ship propeller designs.
So they had to figure it out themselves again.
Yes, and they had a very important insight that changed everything. They realized that a propeller is not just a rotating paddle pushing air backward. It is actually a rotating wing.
A rotating wing. What do you mean?
Think about a wing on an aircraft. It is shaped so that air moves faster over the top and slower underneath. This difference in speed creates lift, an upward force. The Wright brothers realized that a propeller blade works the same way, but instead of creating an upward force, it creates a forward force.
So the propeller is a wing turned sideways and spun around.
That is a perfect way to describe it. And once they understood this, they could apply everything they had already learned about wing shapes from their wind tunnel experiments. They designed propellers that were remarkably efficient.
How efficient were they?
Their propellers converted about 66% of the engine power into forward thrust. Modern propeller designs are only somewhat better than that. For a first attempt, based entirely on their own research, it was an extraordinary achievement.
They really were doing things that professionals and experts had not managed to do.
And they were doing it in a small bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, with simple tools and a very limited budget. They spent less than $1,000 on the entire project of building and testing their flying machine.
$1,000. That is almost unbelievable.
Around the same time, the United States government gave a well-known engineer named Samuel Langley $50,000 to build a flying machine. His machine crashed into the river twice and never flew successfully.
So the government-funded expert failed, and the bicycle mechanics succeeded.
With a fraction of the money, yes. Because the Wright brothers had a clearer understanding of the actual problems that needed to be solved. They were methodical and patient. They did not try to rush.
And all of their testing happened at Kitty Hawk?
Most of the outdoor testing? Yes. Kitty Hawk was remote and difficult to reach. They had to travel far from home and live in a simple wooden shed they built themselves. The weather was harsh. The winds were strong. There were mosquitoes in enormous numbers.
It does not sound like a comfortable place to work.
It was far from comfortable. But the conditions that made it uncomfortable also made it ideal for testing. The strong, steady winds helped their gliders and early powered machine get into the air. And when things crashed, which happened constantly, the soft sand reduced the damage.
How many times did things go wrong before they succeeded?
It is difficult to count. Over 3 years of testing, from 1900 to 1903, they damaged or destroyed their gliders and aircraft many times. Each crash was studied. Each problem was analyzed and corrected. They never gave up and never lost their careful, systematic approach.
It sounds like patience was their most important quality.
Patience and the ability to treat failure as information rather than defeat. Every crash told them something they did not know before. That attitude is what separated them from inventors who gave up after a few failures.
And by late 1903, they were ready.
By December 1903, they had a powered aircraft they called the Flyer. It had their custom engine, their carefully designed propellers, and their 3-axis control system. Everything they had learned over years of work was built into this one machine.
And they brought it to Kitty Hawk one more time.
One final time, in the cold December wind on the sandy dunes of North Carolina, they prepared to attempt something no human had ever done before.
Look at that! It's truly magnificent! The age of flight is finally here.
December 1903, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The temperature was very cold, near freezing. The wind was blowing strongly.
Not a comfortable day to be outside, let alone trying to fly a machine.
No, but the brothers had waited long enough. They had been delayed by mechanical problems for several days. On December 14th, they finally felt ready to try. They had to decide who would fly first.
How did they decide?
They flipped a coin. Wilbur won the toss and made the first attempt on December 14th. But the flight failed. The aircraft climbed too steeply right after leaving the ground, stalled, and landed after just a few seconds. It was not a controlled flight.
Were they discouraged?
They were disappointed, but not discouraged. They repaired the small damage and waited. 3 days later, on December 17th, it was Orville's turn.
Why did they have to wait 3 days?
The aircraft needed repairs from the first attempt, and they were also waiting for good wind conditions. Flying required a certain wind speed to help generate lift.
So December 17th arrived. What was the scene like?
Very quiet and very cold. There were only 5 people present to watch. 4 of them were men from a nearby life-saving station who had agreed to help. The 5th was a young local man who happened to be nearby.
Only 5 witnesses for one of the most important moments in human history.
Yes, there was no crowd, no journalists, no officials, just 5 ordinary people standing on a cold, sandy beach, watching 2 brothers prepare their machine.
And one of them took a photograph.
Yes, one of the life-saving men, John Daniels, had never taken a photograph before in his life. The Wright brothers set up their camera on a tripod and asked him to press the button at the right moment. He did, and the result is one of the most famous photographs ever taken.
The photograph of the flyer just leaving the ground with Orville lying on the wing.
That exact moment, Wilbur is running alongside, just visible to the right. The machine is just a few centimeters above the wooden track they used for takeoff.
What happened when the engine started?
The engine made a loud crackling noise that broke the silence of the dunes. The propellers began to spin. The flyer moved forward along its wooden launch rail, slowly at first, then faster.
And then it lifted.
It lifted into the air. Orville was lying flat on the lower wing, controlling the aircraft. He kept it low, just a few meters above the ground. The aircraft moved forward through the cold air.
And how long did it last?
12 seconds. In those 12 seconds, the flyer traveled 36 meters. By any measure, it was a very short and very low flight. But it was fully controlled, powered, and sustained. It was exactly what they had been working toward.
12 seconds and 36 meters. It is almost hard to believe that such a short flight matters so much.
The distance and time are almost beside the point. What mattered was that it happened at all. For the first time in history, a heavier-than-air machine carried a human being into the air under its own power, moved forward without losing speed, and landed at a point no lower than where it started.
That last part is important. It was not just falling forward.
Exactly right. It was controlled, sustained flight. And they did not stop there. They made 3 more flights that same morning. The last flight of the day, with Wilbur at the controls, lasted 59 seconds and covered 260 meters.
So by the end of that morning, they had already improved dramatically from the first flight.
Yes, and they were excited. They sent a telegram to their father back in Dayton, telling him of the success. The telegram said the flight lasted 57 seconds. It was a small error in the excitement of the moment.
What happened to the flyer after that day?
Later that afternoon, a strong gust of wind rolled it along the ground, and damaged it badly. It never flew again, but it had done what it needed to do. It is now preserved in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C.
And how did the 5 witnesses react that day?
With quiet amazement. John Daniels, the man who took the photograph, later said it was the most wonderful thing he had ever seen. But the world outside those sand dunes was almost completely silent about it.
The newspapers did not cover it?
Very few, and most who did cover it, got the facts wrong. Some newspapers reported that the flight had lasted 3 minutes. Others simply did not believe it had happened at all.
After all that work, the world did not even notice.
Not immediately. The Wright brothers sent press releases to newspapers. Most ignored them. The scientific community was slow to accept the news. It seemed too extraordinary to be true.
But the 12 seconds had happened. Nothing could change that.
Nothing could change that. On a cold morning in December, on a beach that almost nobody had heard of, 2 men from a bicycle shop in Ohio had done what the greatest scientific minds of the age had said was impossible. The sky was no longer unreachable. The age of flight had begun. We have seen the 12 seconds that changed the world. But after that cold December morning, what happened next?
I would have expected the whole world to celebrate immediately.
That would seem natural. But the reaction was almost the opposite. The world largely ignored what had happened at Kitty Hawk. And this silence lasted for years.
Why did people not believe it?
Several reasons. First, the Wright brothers were not famous scientists or engineers. They were bicycle mechanics from a small city. Many people simply could not accept that 2 unknown men had succeeded where famous and well-funded experts had failed.
And the press reports were so inaccurate.
Very inaccurate. The few newspapers that did report the story got the details wrong. Some said the flight lasted minutes instead of seconds. Others mixed up the names of the brothers. The reports seemed unreliable, so editors and readers dismissed them.
What did the Wright brothers do in response?
They kept working. While the world ignored them, they went back to Dayton and continued to improve their aircraft. By 1904 and 1905, they were making flights of several minutes. By late 1905, Wilbur flew for 39 minutes and covered almost 40 kilometers.
So while nobody was paying attention, they were becoming much, much better at flying.
Dramatically better. But they were also very careful about who could watch their flights. They were worried about other people copying their designs before they could protect their invention legally.
So they were secretive.
Very secretive. They stopped flying almost completely in 1906 and 1907 while they waited for patents and tried to sell their aircraft to governments. This secrecy made the skepticism worse. People said, if they have really invented a flying machine, why will nobody let us see it?
That is a difficult situation. The more they protected their work, the less people believed them.
Exactly. Some newspapers began to call them the Lying Brothers instead of the Wright brothers. It was very unfair, but it was the reality they faced.
When did the world finally accept the truth?
In 1908, the Wright brothers made a deal to demonstrate their aircraft publicly. Wilbur went to France, where he flew in front of large crowds and journalists. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming.
What did people see that finally convinced them?
They saw something no European aviator could do. Wilbur flew in smooth, controlled circles. He banked the aircraft, turned precisely, and landed exactly where he intended. European aviation at that time was mostly short, straight, uncontrolled hops. What Wilbur demonstrated was in a completely different category.
So the Europeans could see immediately that this was something far beyond what they had achieved.
One famous French aviator who watched Wilbur fly said that, compared to the Wright brothers, All other aviators were in their infancy. That reaction was typical. The skepticism collapsed almost overnight.
And at the same time, Orville was flying in America.
Yes, Orville was demonstrating the aircraft to the United States Army at Fort Myer in Virginia. The flights were successful and impressive. But then a tragic accident occurred.
What happened?
On September 17, 1908, Orville was flying with a passenger, a young Army officer named Thomas Selfridge. A propeller cracked during the flight. The aircraft lost control and crashed from a height of about 30 meters.
Was anyone hurt?
Selfridge died from his injuries later that day, becoming the first person to die in a powered aircraft accident. Orville was seriously injured and spent weeks recovering in hospital. It was a very dark moment for the brothers.
After everything they had achieved, to have something like that happen.
It was devastating personally, but it did not stop the progress of aviation. By that point, the idea of powered flight was firmly established in the public mind. Other inventors and engineers around the world were working on their own aircraft designs.
And then the First World War changed everything.
The war accelerated aviation technology enormously. Between 1914 and 1918, aircraft went from fragile experimental machines to powerful military tools. Governments invested huge amounts of money in developing faster, stronger, more reliable aircraft.
Because suddenly, flight had a direct military purpose.
Yes, aircraft were used for observation, then for fighting each other, then for bombing targets on the ground. The demands of war pushed engineers to solve problems very quickly. By the end of the war in 1918, aircraft were almost unrecognizable compared to what the Wright brothers had flown in 1903.
And after the war, aviation became available to ordinary people.
Gradually, yes. The 1920s and 1930s saw the development of commercial aviation. Airlines began carrying passengers between cities, then between countries. Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic alone in 1927, which captured the world's imagination and showed that long-distance air travel was possible.
And within a few decades, jet aircraft made travel even faster.
The development was extraordinarily rapid. The Wright brothers flew 36 meters in 12 seconds in 1903. Less than 70 years later, in 1969, a rocket carried humans to the moon. The line from Kitty Hawk to the moon is direct and clear.
That is a breathtaking span of progress in such a short time.
It is perhaps the fastest progression of any technology in human history. And the foundational principles, the three-axis control, the understanding of lift and propulsion, the idea of the pilot actively managing the aircraft, all of these came from those two brothers and their years of patient work.
What happened to Wilbur and Orville after they became famous?
Wilbur died young. He contracted typhoid fever and died in 1912 at the age of 45. It was a terrible loss. Orville lived much longer. He died in 1948, long enough to see jet aircraft and to know that rockets were being developed that would eventually reach space.
So Orville lived to see how far things had gone from that beach in North Carolina.
He did. And he was reportedly a quiet and modest man who did not seek fame or wealth for its own sake. He and Wilbur had simply wanted to solve a problem. The fact that solving it changed the world was almost secondary to them.
That kind of humility is remarkable, given what they achieved.
It is. And their story carries an important message. They succeeded not because they were geniuses who had sudden brilliant ideas. They succeeded because they were systematic, patient, willing to challenge assumptions, and willing to do the hard work of testing and correcting and testing again.
Anyone with curiosity and discipline could follow that method.
In principle, yes. The Wright brothers were not superhuman. They were two ordinary people who approached an extraordinary problem in a very clear-headed way. And that is perhaps the most inspiring part of their story.
The sky truly was no longer the limit after Kitty Hawk.
And today, more than a century later, we live in a world where millions of people fly through the air every single day without giving it much thought. Every one of those flights is a direct descendant of those 12 seconds on a cold December morning in 1903.
12 seconds that contained within them the entire future of human flight.
All of it. In those 12 seconds, a door opened that has never closed. The air above us, which had been unreachable for all of human history, became a place where humans belong. We have reached the end of our journey with the Wright brothers.
We started with Otto Lilienthal gliding through the air and falling. We followed two brothers who read his work and decided to go further.
They solved the problem of control with a twisted cardboard box and years of careful testing. They built their own engine and designed their own propellers because nobody else had what they needed.
They traveled to a remote beach in North Carolina, lived in a wooden shed, and crashed their aircraft again and again until they got it right.
And on December 17, 1903, with 5 witnesses and 1 borrowed camera, they flew.
12 seconds, 36 meters, and everything changed.
The world was slow to believe them, but the truth of what they had done could not be hidden forever. When Wilbur flew in France in 1908, the skeptics fell silent.
From that moment, aviation grew faster than almost anyone had predicted. Wars accelerated it, commerce spread it, and human curiosity pushed it all the way to the moon and beyond.
The Wright brothers did not just invent an aircraft. They proved that careful thinking, patient testing, and refusal to accept conventional wisdom can solve problems that experts say are impossible.
That lesson is as valuable today as it was in 1903.
Perhaps more so. The problems we face today, in energy, in health, in our environment, need the same qualities that Orville and Wilbur brought to those sand dunes.
Curiosity, patience, the willingness to fail and try again.
Thank you for watching The Wings of Kitty Hawk, How the Wright Brothers Conquered the Air.
We hope this story reminds you that the greatest changes in history often begin with ordinary people asking a simple question.
What if it is possible?